"Do not open that box, Mom." The moment my son said those words, I knew something was wrong. It was not what he said that unsettled me. It was how he said it. Michael Parker had always been calm, even as a little boy. But standing in my garage that afternoon, staring at a dusty cardboard box that had belonged to his late father, he suddenly looked like a man who had seen a ghost. I froze with my hand resting on the lid. For a second, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than the box itself. "My name is Helen Parker. I am 71 years old, and for nearly 50 years, George Parker was my husband, my partner, and my best friend. He passed away a little over a year ago after a brief illness that changed everything. Since then, I had been trying to do what widows all across America do every day. I kept moving forward. Some days were easier than others. Some mornings I still reached across the bed expecting to find him there. Other days I could almost convince myself I was adjusting. That Saturday began like any other. The South Carolina sun was already warming the driveway as I sorted through years of accumulated belongings in our garage. George had always been organized, but there were corners even he never seemed interested in touching. One shelf in particular held old camping gear, faded holiday decorations, and several sealed boxes covered in dust. I was moving a stack of paint cans when I noticed one of them. Unlike the others, it had a label written in George's unmistakable handwriting. My heart skipped when I read the words. "For Helen. Open only if something feels wrong." I stood there staring at the box for nearly a minute. Something feels wrong. The sentence echoed in my mind. Over the past year, I had felt many things. Lonely, tired, forgotten, but wrong was the word that fit best. Ever since George died, my relationship with Michael had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. It happened in small ways. Fewer phone calls, shorter visits, holidays organized without asking my opinion, family decisions made before I even knew discussions were happening. Whenever I tried to talk about it, Michael assured me I was imagining things. Rachel, his wife, always smiled politely and changed the subject. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. Yet the feeling never disappeared. Something felt off, and I could never explain why. I carried the box into the garage doorway where sunlight illuminated years of dust across its surface. That was when Michael arrived unexpectedly. He had told me earlier that week he might stop by, but I had not expected him until evening. The moment he saw the box in my hands, all the color drained from his face. "Mom," he said quickly, "you do not need to go through that." I looked at him carefully. "Why not?" His eyes moved from me to the box and back again. For the first time in my life, my son seemed unable to find words. Michael Parker always had something to say. Advice, explanations, opinions. But now he simply stood there staring. I glanced down at the label once more. Then I slowly lifted the lid. And the expression on my son's face told me that whatever was inside had the power to change everything I thought I knew about my family. For several seconds, neither Michael nor I moved. Dust floated through the sunlight streaming into the garage, and the old cardboard lid rested loosely in my hands. Whatever was inside that box, my son clearly did not want me to see it. That realization unsettled me far more than the box itself. I looked at Michael and waited for an explanation. None came. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and glanced toward the driveway, as if searching for an excuse to leave. The behavior felt so unlike him that it only deepened my curiosity. Slowly, I lifted the lid completely and looked inside. The first thing I saw was a stack of neatly organized folders secured with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them sat several photo albums, a leather journal, and a large envelope that had yellowed with age. Everything was arranged with the same care George brought to every important task in his life. My husband never did anything halfway. If he spent time creating this collection, there was a reason. Michael stepped closer. "Mom, maybe this is something you should look through later." His voice sounded forced. I looked up. "Why?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No answer. I carried the box into the house and placed it on the dining room table. Michael followed silently. The room felt different with George's box sitting in the center of it, almost as though he had returned for one final conversation. The dining room had been George's favorite room in the house. Every Sunday after church we gathered there for lunch. Family birthdays were celebrated there. Holiday dinners stretched for hours around that table. Looking at the box now, I found myself remembering those years with unusual clarity. Back then, family felt simple. After George passed away, that feeling slowly disappeared. The changes were small at first. Michael called less often. Rachel began organizing family events without mentioning them until the last minute. Sometimes I learned about gatherings only after seeing photographs online. Whenever I asked questions, everyone acted as though nothing was wrong. Yet I could never shake the feeling that I had somehow drifted to the edge of my own family. As I sat down, my eyes settled on the leather journal resting near the top of the box. Before I could reach for it, something else caught my attention. Taped to the inside of the lid was a handwritten note. The moment I saw George's handwriting, my chest tightened. The message was short. Helen, if you are reading this, trust what you find here. Some truths become harder to see with time. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Across the table, Michael lowered his eyes. My pulse quickened. What does that mean? I asked quietly. He rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the floor. I do not know. The answer came too quickly. For the first time since opening the box, I became certain of something. My son knew more than he was willing to say. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. I reached for the large envelope resting beneath the journal. Across the front, written in bold black ink, were 4 words that immediately sent a chill through me. Family history. Read last. I looked up at Michael again. His face had gone pale. And in that moment, I realized the box was not about the past. It was about something that was still affecting our family. Right now, Michael left less than an hour later. He claimed he had errands to run, but neither of us believed that explanation. The moment the front door closed behind him, the house felt unusually quiet. I stood in the dining room staring at George's box. For more than a year, it had sat untouched somewhere in our garage. Now it felt as though it was pulling me toward answers I had not even known I was searching for. I sat down and carefully removed the blue ribbon holding the folders together. The first folder contained photographs. Hundreds of them. Family vacations, birthday parties, church events, school graduations. At first they seemed ordinary. Then I noticed something unusual. Every photograph had notes written on the back in George's handwriting. Dates, locations, names, small details most people would never think to record. George had always been organized, but this felt different. It felt intentional, as though he knew these photographs would matter one day. I spent the next hour moving slowly through the collection. Many of the images brought back memories I had not thought about in years. There was Michael at 10 years old holding a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. There was Rachel during her first Thanksgiving with our family. There was Olivia as a little girl sitting on George's shoulders during a 4th of July parade. Looking at those pictures made me smile. Yet beneath the warmth, another feeling was beginning to grow. Curiosity. Why had George preserved all of this so carefully? Beneath the photographs sat a stack of receipts, letters, event programs, and newspaper clippings. Some dated back more than 30 years. Every item seemed connected to important family moments. The more I looked, the more I realized George had been documenting our lives with extraordinary detail. By late afternoon, sunlight stretched across the dining room floor. I reached for the leather journal resting near the bottom of the box. The cover showed years of wear. George must have carried it often. Inside were handwritten entries spanning nearly a decade. They were not daily diary entries. Instead, they focused on significant family events, holiday gatherings, milestones, community projects, important conversations. The first few pages seemed harmless enough. Then I found an entry from 7 years earlier. I immediately recognized the event. It was a large family fundraiser held at our church. I remembered spending months helping organize it. According to George's notes, dozens of relatives contributed. Yet something caught my attention. In the margin, George had written a short observation. Interesting how the story changes each year. I frowned. Story changes. The phrase stayed with me. A few pages later, I found another note beside an entirely different event. People remember what they hear most often. My pulse quickened. Suddenly the box no longer felt like a collection of keepsakes. It felt like evidence. Not evidence of a crime. Evidence of something harder to define. Memory. Narrative. Truth. I flipped through several more entries. Similar comments appeared again and again. Small observations. Quiet concerns. George never sounded angry. He sounded worried. Then a folded sheet of paper slipped from between 2 pages and landed on the table. I unfolded it carefully. At the top, written in bold letters, were 5 words that immediately sent a chill through me. Things Michael must remember. I stared at the page. Then I looked toward the empty chair where my son had been sitting only an hour earlier. And for the first time, I began to understand why he had wanted that box to remain closed. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the sheet titled Things Michael Must Remember. The paper was worn at the edges, as though George had handled it many times before placing it inside the journal. I expected a list of personal reminders, birthdays, family traditions, important dates. Instead, the first line stopped me cold. Never forget who was there before the stories changed. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard. Inside, the dining room seemed strangely still. I continued reading. George had listed several family events from different years. Beside each event, he recorded what happened and who contributed. There was the church fundraiser I remembered so well. There was a community food drive. There was a scholarship program we helped establish for local students. Each entry included names, dates, and details. More importantly, each entry included a note explaining how the story was later retold. The differences were subtle, almost invisible. A contribution omitted here, a detail changed there, a role gradually reassigned over time. None of it seemed dramatic on its own. Yet together, the pattern was impossible to ignore. As I read, memories began resurfacing. I remembered family dinners where Rachel would tell a story and everyone would nod along. I remembered hearing versions of events that felt slightly off but never seemed important enough to correct. I remembered Michael sitting quietly beside her. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he looked uncomfortable, but he rarely said anything. At the time, I assumed he was avoiding conflict. Now I was beginning to wonder if he was protecting something else. Near the middle of the page, George had written a paragraph addressed directly to our son. You were present for these moments. You know what happened. One day it may seem easier to stay silent. Do not confuse silence with kindness. Truth deserves a voice. My chest tightened. George was not writing about distant possibilities. He was writing about something he had already seen happening. I set the paper down and walked toward the family photographs displayed on a nearby shelf. One picture showed Michael at 14 standing beside George during a neighborhood cleanup project. Another showed all three of us serving meals at a church event. Looking at those photographs, I realized Michael had witnessed nearly every event mentioned in the journal. He had not heard stories secondhand. He had lived them. That thought stayed with me long after sunset. Later that evening, I opened another folder from the box. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, and event programs carefully organized by year. Several items matched the entries George had recorded. Every document supported the same version of events, the version he wanted Michael to remember. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Michael. Just 3 words. Please stop reading. I stared at the screen. No explanation. No greeting. No follow-up. My pulse quickened. The message confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The box contained something my son desperately wished would remain buried. I placed the phone face down on the table and looked again at George's journal. There were still several folders unopened. The large envelope marked family history. Read last remained untouched. Whatever truth George had spent years preserving, I had only uncovered the beginning. And judging by my son's reaction, the most important part was still waiting for me. The next morning, I woke up thinking about Michael's message. Please stop reading. Those 3 words lingered in my mind as I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the sun rise over the backyard. If the contents of George's box were meaningless, my son would not care whether I continued. If they were simply old memories, he would have laughed and told me not to waste my time. Instead, he wanted me to stop. That alone told me I needed to keep going. After breakfast, I returned to the dining room table. The box sat exactly where I had left it. The folders remained neatly stacked beside George's journal. I opened another file and found several years' worth of correspondence between George and community organizations, church leaders, and local charities. At first, the documents seemed unrelated. Then I noticed something familiar. Many of the events mentioned in the letters were the same ones described in the journal. More importantly, they confirmed the details George had recorded. Dates matched. Names matched. Responsibilities matched. The evidence was remarkably consistent. By midday, I began creating a timeline on a yellow legal pad. On one side, I listed events exactly as George documented them. On the other, I wrote down how those same stories had been described at family gatherings over the years. The differences were impossible to ignore. A volunteer effort became one person's accomplishment. A group project became an individual success story. Contributions disappeared. Roles shifted. The changes were rarely dramatic. Yet they always moved in the same direction. As I studied the timeline, memories resurfaced. I remembered a family dinner 5 years earlier when Rachel described a community fundraiser. Several details were inaccurate. I had almost corrected her. Before I could speak, Michael smiled and changed the subject. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now that moment seemed different. Then another memory surfaced. A holiday gathering. A conversation about a scholarship fund. Once again, details changed. Once again, Michael remained silent. The realization settled heavily over me. My son had known these stories were shifting. Perhaps not every detail. Perhaps not every time. But often enough. He had been present. He had heard the changes. And he had chosen not to challenge them. Around 3 o'clock, the phone rang. It was Olivia. My granddaughter called every few weeks to check on me. We spoke about ordinary things at first. Work, family, weekend plans. Then she asked what I had been doing lately. I glanced toward George's box. Going through some of your grandfather's records, I replied. Olivia laughed softly. That sounds exactly like Grandpa. He saved everything. There was affection in her voice. The comment made me smile. George had saved everything. Not because he was sentimental. Because he believed details mattered. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. Then I reached for the large envelope labeled Family History. Read last. It remained sealed. Whatever was inside had clearly been important enough for George to separate from everything else. Yet before opening it, I wanted to understand the rest of the story. I wanted context. I wanted answers. As evening approached, I opened the final folder remaining outside the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, written in George's handwriting, were 6 words that instantly made my heart race. What Michael never told you about this. For several moments, I simply stared at the sheet of paper. The title alone was enough to make my pulse quicken. What Michael never told you about this. George had never been a dramatic man. He did not leave cryptic messages or play games. If he wrote those words, he did so for a reason. I took a deep breath and began reading. The page contained several handwritten notes connected to different family events. At first glance, they appeared unrelated. Then a pattern emerged. Beside each event, George had recorded a moment when Michael privately acknowledged one version of the truth, but publicly remained silent while another version took its place. One entry described a community fundraiser. According to George's notes, Michael admitted afterward that important contributions had been overlooked. Yet when the story was retold months later, he said nothing. Another entry described a scholarship program. Again, Michael recognized that details had changed. Again, he remained silent. The final note on the page struck me hardest of all. George wrote that he once asked Michael why he never corrected the record. My hands tightened around the paper as I read his answer. It is easier this way, Dad. I closed my eyes. The sentence felt painfully familiar. Not because I had heard those exact words before. Because I had witnessed that attitude countless times over the years. Michael hated conflict. Even as a child, he preferred peace over confrontation. If 2 friends argued, he walked away. If tension filled a room, he changed the subject. George used to say that kindness was one of Michael's greatest strengths. But now I wondered whether that same instinct had become a weakness. As evening settled outside, I found myself revisiting memories from the past decade. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, community events. Moments when I sensed something was off, but could never explain why. Looking back, Michael was almost always there. Quiet, observing, choosing not to speak. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because he had created the problem, because he had allowed it to continue. Around 7 o'clock, there was a knock at the front door. I opened it to find Olivia standing on the porch holding 2 cups of coffee. She smiled and held one out to me. Thought you might need this. I laughed softly and invited her inside. Olivia had inherited many of George's qualities. She noticed things other people missed. We sat together at the dining room table. Her eyes immediately landed on the open box and scattered papers. You have been busy, she said. I nodded. For the next hour, I showed her some of the photographs, letters, and notes. I avoided drawing conclusions. Instead, I let the documents speak for themselves. Olivia studied everything carefully. Occasionally she asked questions. Occasionally she sat quietly thinking. Finally, she picked up one of the photographs and looked at me. Grandma, why would Grandpa save all of this? The question lingered in the air between us. I looked around at the journals, records, and photographs covering the table. Then my eyes settled on the large envelope still waiting to be opened. Family history. Read last. I realized I finally knew the answer. George was not preserving the past. He was protecting the future. Before I could respond, Olivia noticed the sealed envelope. She pointed toward it. "What is in there?" she asked. I looked at the handwriting on the front and felt a chill run through me. Whatever answers I had found so far were only pieces of a much larger story. And for the first time, I was ready to open the final envelope. Olivia and I sat quietly at the dining room table as the evening grew darker outside. The sealed envelope rested between us. For nearly 2 hours, we had examined photographs, letters, journals, and records that George carefully preserved. Each document revealed another piece of the story. Yet both of us knew the envelope was different. George had labeled it separately. He wanted it read last. That meant whatever was inside mattered more than everything else. I ran my fingers across the worn paper. Then I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter several pages long. The first line immediately caught my attention. "If you are reading this, then the silence has already lasted too long." My heart began to race. Olivia leaned closer as I continued reading. George explained that he created the box because he noticed something happening gradually over many years. Family stories were changing. Small details disappeared. Contributions were forgotten. Certain voices grew louder while others faded into the background. According to George, the problem was never a single event. It was repetition. A story told often enough eventually became accepted as truth. Then came the part that surprised me most. George wrote directly about Michael. Not with anger, not with disappointment, with concern. He described several conversations they shared over the years. During those talks, Michael privately acknowledged that many family stories were becoming distorted. He noticed details changing. He recognized when important facts were omitted. Yet he rarely challenged them. George believed Michael convinced himself that remaining silent helped keep peace within the family. Reading those words made my chest ache. Because I knew they were true. My son always avoided conflict whenever possible. George continued, "Michael loves his family. That is not the problem. His mistake was believing that silence protects people. Sometimes silence only protects confusion." I lowered the letter and stared across the room. The house felt unusually still. Olivia gently touched my arm. "Grandma," she said softly, "Grandpa understood all of this a long time ago." I nodded. That realization hit me harder than anything else. George had spent years watching these changes unfold, not because he enjoyed documenting them, because he feared what would happen if nobody preserved the truth. As I continued reading, I discovered something else. Attached to the final pages were copies of old letters, event records, and family notes that connected every major story documented in the box. Together, they formed a complete timeline. Not one dramatic secret, not one shocking revelation. Something far more powerful. A clear record of what actually happened. When I finished the final page, neither Olivia nor I spoke for several moments. Finally, she picked up one of the photographs from the table. It showed George standing beside Michael many years ago. Both were smiling. Both looked happy. Olivia stared at it quietly. Then she asked a question that stayed with me long after she left that night. If Grandpa worked this hard to protect the truth, why did he think someone would need protecting from it? I looked down at the letter in my hands. For the first time, I believed I knew the answer. George was never worried about the past. He was worried about what the future would look like if the truth disappeared completely. And suddenly I realized there was only one person left who could answer the questions George had spent years preparing me to ask. The following afternoon, I called Michael and asked if he could come over for dinner. My voice sounded calm, much calmer than I felt. There was a brief pause before he agreed. He did not ask why. Somehow, I think he already knew. As the day passed, I arranged everything on the dining room table. George's journal, the photographs, the letters, the timelines I had created, the final envelope. The entire story sat neatly organized beneath the warm glow of the dining room light. Looking at it all together felt overwhelming. Not because it exposed some terrible secret, because it revealed how many years had passed while everyone pretended not to notice what was happening. Shortly before 6 o'clock, Michael arrived. Rachel came with him. A few minutes later, Olivia stopped by as well. The atmosphere felt polite but uneasy. Everyone sensed that this dinner was different. We sat together at the same table where George and I had shared countless meals over the years. For several minutes, conversation remained superficial. Weather, work, weekend plans. Eventually, I reached toward the box. The room immediately grew quiet. Michael lowered his eyes. Rachel folded her hands together. Olivia sat perfectly still. I opened the journal and placed it in the center of the table. Then I began reading several entries aloud. Not dramatically, simply reading George's own words exactly as he wrote them. Dates, events, names, contributions, details preserved years before any disagreement existed. Nobody interrupted. Next came the photographs, then the letters, then the newsletters and event records. Piece by piece, a consistent picture emerged. The same people appeared. The same facts appeared. The same truth appeared. After nearly 30 minutes, Rachel finally spoke. Her voice remained calm. People remember things differently sometimes. The statement hung in the air. Nobody argued with her. Instead, Olivia quietly slid one of the original documents across the table. Then another. Then another. Every document matched George's records. Every photograph supported the same timeline. The room fell silent again. I looked at Michael. He stared at the table. For years, I had wondered whether he understood what was happening. Now I knew he did. The question was no longer whether he knew. The question was why he never spoke. Finally, I reached for George's letter and read the passage addressed directly to him. The words about silence. The words about truth deserving a voice. When I finished, Michael closed his eyes. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Then he slowly looked up. There was no anger in his expression. No defensiveness. Only exhaustion. Dad talked to me about this more than once, he said quietly. The admission seemed to drain the last bit of tension from the room. He rubbed his forehead and stared at the photographs spread across the table. I knew some stories were changing. I noticed it. I just kept telling myself it was not important enough to fight about. His voice grew softer. Then years passed. The words hurt because they sounded honest. Not calculated. Not rehearsed. Honest. Rachel remained silent beside him. Olivia looked down at the documents in front of her. I sat there listening to my son finally say aloud what George had spent years trying to preserve. And as Michael looked around the table at the evidence surrounding him, I realized something important. The truth was no longer trapped inside a box. It was sitting in the middle of the family. And for the first time in many years, nobody was looking away from it. For a long time after Michael spoke, nobody at the table said a word. The documents remained spread across the polished wood surface like pieces of a puzzle that had finally been assembled. Outside, the evening sky darkened beyond the dining room windows. Inside, I felt something I had not expected. Relief. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Relief. For more than a year after George passed away, I had carried a quiet feeling that something was wrong. I could never explain it. I could never prove it. Now, sitting at the same table where George and I had spent so much of our lives, I finally understood what he had been trying to leave behind. It was never about exposing anyone. It was about preserving what was true. Michael looked around the room at the photographs, letters, and journals. Then his eyes settled on an old picture near the edge of the table. I recognized it immediately. George and I were standing beside a church fellowship hall during a fundraiser nearly 20 years earlier. Michael was there too, smiling beside us. He picked up the photograph and stared at it for several moments. I remember this day, he said quietly. Dad spent the entire weekend organizing volunteers. You barely sat down for 2 days. He shook his head slowly. I do not know when I stopped remembering things the way they actually happened. Nobody answered. There was nothing to add. Some realizations need room to breathe. Finally, Michael looked directly at me. His eyes reflected something I had not seen in a very long time. Not guilt. Not shame. Understanding. I am sorry, Mom, he said. I thought staying quiet would keep everyone happy. I never realized what that silence was costing. The words settled gently into the room. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I thought about everything George had written. The notes. The journals. The letters. The countless hours he spent preserving details most people would have dismissed as unimportant. Suddenly it all made sense. George understood that memory fades. Stories change. People forget. But truth deserves a place to live. Rachel remained quiet throughout the conversation. Eventually, she glanced toward the photographs and documents spread across the table. Maybe we all got too comfortable repeating the same stories, she said softly. It was not an excuse. It was not a defense. It was simply an acknowledgement. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt like enough. Over the following weeks, the box became something entirely different. Instead of remaining hidden in a garage, its contents became part of our family again. Olivia helped organize photographs and scan documents into digital files. Michael spent hours reading through George's journals. Sometimes he called me just to ask about a name, a date, or a memory. Little by little, conversations changed. People stopped speaking with certainty about things they had not witnessed. They started asking questions. They started listening. One afternoon, several months later, I placed George's letter back inside the box and returned it to the shelf in my study. The box looked smaller than I remembered, perhaps because its weight was never in the cardboard or the papers. Its weight came from what it carried. Before leaving the room, I rested my hand on the lid and smiled. George had given us one final gift. Not money, not property, not instructions. He gave us the truth. And in the end, that truth did exactly what he hoped it would do. It brought our family back to itself.